Welcome everybody back to MACNA 2022. Our next speaker has been a glass blower. He's been a performing artist on cruise boats. He's a juggler that knows comedians, and somehow he landed a job at some big aquarium in the Bay Area of California, and was important for a while, and now he just talks on YouTube for a living, to my knowledge. It's Richard Ross. He's one of my board members, and I'd like to welcome him to MACNA 2022 to talk about problem algae control in reef tanks. Please welcome Richard Ross.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming out on, is it Sunday? It's Sunday. We're going to talk about problem algae and what to do about it. Make sure this works. That's me. I like cephalopods a lot. This is my family. We take Halloween very seriously. During the summers now, I do a lot of this. This is kiteboarding by the Golden Gate Bridge, which is excellent if you can do it. And I also like to scare people around the island I live on by dressing up as death and e-foiling around the island and scaring people. Because it's just a stupid thing to do to spend your time. I have a secret home lab right here where I'm doing some consulting and some research and some spawning stuff. I also do a podcast with Ben Johnson called Reef Beef. It was voted the #1 foul-languaged reef podcast by Foul Language Reef Podcast voters. Thank you. This is my display tank, and actually this is my tank as it is now. And in 2014, I did a talk about phosphates and how I don't care about what level they are at. And I actually predicted in that talk, and it got a laugh, that people would be dosing nitrate and phosphates to their tanks, and that's happened, and that makes me giggle all the time. So this is the tank in 2016, and the phosphate was 1.6, and the nitrates were 70. And this is germane to the talk. I have been bringing it down because I wanted to see if I could bring it down in the completely most lazy, easiest way where I had to do nothing, which there's two of them. One of them is dosing a really light amount of lanthanum chloride.
Phil.
What's going on?
Phil?
So, MACNA is an organization where you can meet Kevin. They don't like my thing?
Nope, I don't like your thing.
Okay. Oh, is everything showing all goofy?
It was.
Oh, bad dongle. No dongle. Back dongle?
Good dongle.
Oh! Gone. Thanks, Kevin. I wouldn't have noticed. What was I saying? Phosphates are coming down because I'm dosing lanthanum very slowly into the skimmer. And I'm also now doing a water change, auto water change. I do about 8 liters a day in a 450-gallon system. And that's for Craig Bingman to make his head explode. So the levels now are 0.18, and the nitrate is about 20. So no algae there. When the numbers were crazy, no algae there, and we'll get to that in a second. This is some corals I spawned. That's a whole bunch of baby corals. That's very cool. And here's the same thing again. So we'll just move on. Problem algae in tanks. So what's the deal with that, right? We care about bad algae, whatever you want to call it. Or whatever type it is. We'll touch on a few, but we're doing a general talk rather than a specific of each algae, because I actually think picking out each species of algae is insane at this point, but will eventually be useful. But the algae, people don't like how it looks, although I was talking to Mike Paletta last night and telling him about the tank I had in 1983 that was a 60-gallon tank filled with live rock with a beautiful juvenile Navaricus angel, and it was covered in algae, and it was friggin' beautiful. It was like, that's what it looks like, because if you didn't know then, and there was no way to find out. I was very happy with that tank, and then laughed very hard when I found out that that wasn't what it was supposed to look like. But looks aside, problem algae can grow over, smother, and kill the animals you actually want in the tank. So we don't want that to happen. Common responses on forums and at fish stores and at places where people talk about the things we're talking about to algae problems are add a chemical to kill it, Wait it out. Lower your nutrients. Manual removal. Add herbivores, or thoughts and prayers. So that's pretty much what people say. So we're going to talk about those as we go through. Additives to control algae. Not a fan in any way. Well, this is maybe a 4% fan for special cases. But I'm not a fan of additives to eradicate anything in your tank at all. We spend so much time trying to make the system stable. And, that was kind of what the push has been for a long time. And in thinking about it over the last couple of years, stability, I'm back to stability is the key. But it's tricky to say that because it's stability, it means something different when you're starting your tank and something later. So a mature tank, I don't do anything to my tank. It gets an auto water change, it gets some trace elements added because it's easy and inexpensive, and there's a skimmer, and that's it. And then I feed a lot of food to my tank. And then once in a while, I wipe the front glass. There's literally, when I leave for this, the only thing I'm worried about is a power outage happening and something not coming back online. I am interested in the tank and what's inside of it. So I want it to be easy so I can spend my time enjoying the animals, right? So I don't like these additives because we don't know what they do to your microbiome, and then you end up in this kind of sine wave of problem after problem after problem as your tank recovers from whatever this stuff did. Turns out that this stuff is super bad. It's just an algicide, and people seems like they were just getting lucky if they weren't killing everything. So there's a whole drama behind that, and we don't need to get into it. This one is interesting, fluconazole. It really does seem to work. So if you are nuking your algae from space, which we'll get to, if it's become a real problem, this might be a good way to go. If you've got little tufts, I'm not thinking that that's the way to go. And we'll get to all of that. So I'm not a fan of, I think you're just taking a huge risk, and I've got to have a really, really good reason why I need to add this stuff, any of these things to a tank to take care of algae. Algae in new tanks is an issue, and it's different than in old tanks because we get the uglies, which is really benthic succession. So these are things that we talk about in the scientific community. And what that means is if you put a clean piece of anything, a clean substrate in a tank, a clean rock, clean sand, a clean frag plug, it's going to take time for different microbial and microfaunal communities to develop on it. So that's just, you can't make that not happen. I think also some people have an idea that the rock should be this color forever, and they kind of freak out when stuff starts happening to it. I think that's the biggest issue with dry live rock, is people expect it to look like this as the tank grows, and then they'll tear down their tank because they get some algae on this rock, and then there's no way you're getting the stability that I think is important. This is what live rock looks like in the ocean. This, unfortunately, this is Buck Island. This is a coral graveyard where the Acropora palmata has died off over the last 25 years. You can see in the bottom that, no, it doesn't. Oh, I can do that. Look, I have a thing. You guys don't get to see what I'm talking about. There's a little bit of live palmata there, but the rest of it is dead. It has died off. But look at the color of it. It is not white. Things need to grow on surfaces, and we like those things because they help filter and they help feed our tanks, so they're good. So don't expect white stuff. Here's a little bit, and when we're doing coral spawning, this may change, when we want baby corals to settle, the tradition has been to season those tiles, those substrates, for a couple of months to get past the uglies so that when the corals settle down, they're easier to take care of. You really don't want to be dealing with a hair algae on a coral plug with a single polyp coral that's 1 millimeter across. It's a nightmare to clean. So you start seeing the rock change color. Here's a picture of some mature rock with some white new rock that's put in there. So they look different, and you've got to let it season. What tends to happen, though, is something like this happens, and then people freak out and don't know what to do. So And then also, eventually in benthic succession, you'll get, well, I'm ahead of myself. Look, if you're setting up a new tank, understand this concept and be ready for it. So what does that mean? What we used to say in the 2000s when I was working in fish stores or helping out in fish stores is you set up your tank and you leave the lights off. And by the way, we were using imported fresh live rock then. It's the same thing. Benthic succession happens everywhere, especially when you move something into a new tank. It's got to adapt to the new conditions, a piece of rock. Set it up, leave the lights off for the first month. Just no lights. Just have a dark tank. You're not putting any animals in it. You're not doing anything. You're letting everything settle down. The idea that nothing good happens fast in a reef tank starts at the beginning. And I know there's a push to want to set up a brand new system and have it going really quickly. And there's a way to do that, which we'll talk about. But if you don't have the space to do that kind of thing, just take the time. Pay the time up front, and your life will be much easier. If you put a bunch of lights on your tank and you grow that, now you have to fight this. And once you're in a fight with it, it's a pain in the butt, frankly. And you have to deal with it, and you have to do more work than you should have to do. And I want everyone to have an easier time at reef keeping. So what do? Age your rock. You leave it in the tank for a month or two if you can deal with that. But you can put a fish in there if you want to see a fish. But if you're patient, and then you bring your lights up slowly over the second month as you're adding herbivores to deal with things, you shouldn't get problems because you've got if you get coralline algae to grow on your rock or a bunch of different things from the microfauna or microbiome, they will compete for real estate with the algae. If not, and we'll talk about this too, I've said that like 50 times, I love it. Algae's really good at life. Algae is going to win. Algae can live, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right. What we used to do at Steinert Aquarium, and I do this at home as well, is I keep a bunch of live rock in a sump. So we had these huge sumps behind the scenes, and I would fill them up with rock. And when it was time for me to set up a new system, I would pull out this rock, set it up, instant system, right? Took a week to acclimate to the light, and we're all good. People who didn't do that, people who started with fresh rock like this, because it's displayed to the public, it's got to come up soon so people can see it. But then they were fighting algae problems for months. And fighting algae problems on public display is even harder than it is at home. And if you don't want to do it in your display, if you're like, I don't want an ugly tank for a dark thing in my living room or wherever you're keeping it for a couple of months, get a big brute trash can or an ag container or an old tank and put the rock in there and treat that like a temporary aquarium. Fill it with salt water, put a skimmer on it or not, it's up to you. Have some water motion, keep it warm, and let that rock season in there. So now you've jumped months ahead of what's going to happen if you don't do that. We used to have a lot of stores that would keep cured rock. Back in the day, they used to do it because there would be a die-off on the rock. So if anybody remembers the idea of cooking rock, which was the stupidest term, actually it's the best term in the world, turned out doesn't work because people boiled their rock, which don't. And then there's palithoa on the rock they're boiling, and then they all go to the hospital, and that's fun. But the ickies, you would really have to do water changes and deal with that because goo would come off of that rock. So good stores or nice stores would cure that for you. I think we need more stores curing this dry rock for you. You can also buy live rock from like Tampa Bay Saltwater, and they'll fly it to you. And they fly it completely submerged now, so you don't get the same die-off we used to get. But if you do that stuff in your garage or out in your backyard for a couple months, and then you put it in your tank, you'll have a much faster, good-looking display, right? And coralline algae is kind of one of the best examples. Hair algae cannot grow on that. It can grow around it, but this stuff can grow so fast it will grow over hair algae and smother it. So you've taken away from the algae any real estate that it can use. Then you're winning, and you want to be winning. Controlling nutrients to end algae problems. So people seem obsessed with controlling nutrients. I'm on a different side of that. We don't have to have any argument about it. There's room for all of us to sit at the table and do it different ways. I don't like taking the time and money it takes to try to lower those nutrients. I don't find a difference in my corals. I find that I have just as much problem with certain kinds of corals as people who run lower nutrient systems. I think it's a wash either way, and you're just moving the work around to what you feel comfortable doing. And that's fine. There's a million ways to skin a reef. People who are pushing the nutrient stuff and dealing with ratios and seeing results that they see, that's great. That's pushing the hobby in a different direction than I'm going, and I think that's great because eventually, along with microbiome testing and eDNA, we will have enough information to get ahead of all of this stuff, and we'll know what's going on. We'll be able to target what we want and what we don't want in our tank. But right now, the idea seems to be more general. Algae needs fertilizer to grow. More fertilizer would mean more algae. That just seems obvious. And less fertilizer would mean less algae, right? QED. I think not so much. I think if this was the case, it would work all the time, or it would work more than we see. And what I mean by that is, there are lots of posts and lots of reports of people who lower their nutrients and the algae doesn't go away. So clearly it's not, if lowering nutrients makes a difference, it's clearly not the only thing that makes a difference, right? And we see people with low nutrients that have no algae problems and low nutrients that have algae problems. And we see people with high nutrients with algae problems and people with high nutrients that don't have algae problems. So while this idea seems to make sense, I don't think it pans out on second look. And I don't think it pans out in reality. And why is that? Because algae is really, really, really good at life. It survives in puddles of vomit. That's not true. I don't know who's keeping puddles of vomit, so maybe I'll run that test when I have time. But it really trying environments, really horrible environments. It's kind of a primitive, been around for a long time kind of life, and it's really good at using tiny amounts of whatever it needs to survive, right? And thrive and grow and kill everything else around it, which is its goal, right? Algae's goal in its teeny little algae brain is, I want to kill everything else so I can live in its house. It scavenges what it needs very quickly. So think of it this way too. If you're lowering your nitrates and your phosphate to fight algae, and we think that wild reefs are a model for us, right? The average nitrate levels on a reef are less than 0.2 ppm, right? We recommend that you keep it from 5 to 10, right? That's the general recommendation. I say if it's below 50, you're fine. Below 70, you're fine. I get worried when it gets to be 90 because 100's a scary number. That's literally the reason why I lower it when it was getting that high. Phosphate levels on the reef are less than 0.03 ppm, and we generally think 0.05 to under 0.1 is and some people are not happy when it's at 0.1. So there's algae everywhere. Look. It's like I was with Andy Ryan trying to come up with a metaphor or analogy to explain this, and he sent me this last night. So I'm not sure if this is the best metaphor at all, but in this video, the cat are your corals, food are your nutrient levels, and the duck is algae. That's a funny way to present the duck. There's no duck yet. Okay, and so here we go. Right? So, I hope that metaphor makes sense. No matter if you decide to lower nutrients, in this case the food, the duck's going to get it before the cat. And then your cat is going to starve, which is okay, because who cares about cats? But you can't, if you bring your nutrients down to nothing, so there's nothing there for the algae to survive on, it will still survive longer than you think it's going to, and that it has any right to, but you're not getting ahead of it. It can use nothing to grow. And these are all my opinions, and I hope if anyone agrees with me, they rip me apart in a way that is compelling. On the wild reef, I think people think there's no algae on the wild reef. I don't see any algae in this picture. I don't see any algae in this picture, right? But there's algae everywhere on the reef, right? So why don't you see it? I was in French Polynesia in January and snorkeling around, and it all just kind of hit me in a way that it never coalesced in my brain before. So this is snorkeling, so it's a little bouncy, sorry for that. This is what's going on a healthy reef in French Polynesia. Those are herbivores, and there's a butt ton of them, and they're going around the reef eating all the time. Eating, right? Schools of herbivores don't exist if there's nothing for them to eat. They need to eat. So these guys, and there's convict tanks, and you can see there's also huge schools of little parrotfish doing that as well, which is interesting on herbivores. If I forget to mention that later, please somebody remember for me. So they're swimming around, they're eating, constantly grazing all around. This was a tiny little island that was a coral garden, and you could swim around it in 10 minutes, and there was about 6 schools of these tangs, and the same with the parrotfish. Sometimes they would intermingle, some of them they wouldn't. But we went there 7 times, and all the time, they're just there swimming around. They're eating the algae as it grows, right, before it becomes a problem. That's the only way they exist. And there's not just the fish, right? There's bazillions of herbivores that we don't see. There's snails, there's urchin, there's amphipods, and all other kind of tiny herbivores, and they're all eating the algae. The reason the coral can be there is because they're eating the algae. And then the coral ends up giving them shelter, so it's this kind of self-fulfilling way to go. Where is there algae on the reef? So this was another reef that I was able to snorkel at in a totally different location. But inside these coral heads are these jackass fish. And in this particular location, there were no sharks in the area. So there were a lot of these fish. And these are a damselfish. I think it's called jackassy damselfishy jerky is the Latin. And I didn't plan that, but that's great. And they farm the algae. They chase everything away from it. And the algae grows. And the only reason it grows in these low nutrient levels that we're talking about on wild reefs that we often don't even recommend as the levels we're trying to keep in our tanks, the algae grows. It doesn't not grow. There were no sharks in this area. And in other areas where there were more sharks, these guys were getting eaten. And so there were fewer of them. In this area, there was like almost no herbivores. And if somebody knows more about that than me, my guess is that these jackass fish don't like herbivores, and when they see them, they chase them away. There were literally, and we snorkeled this for 3 days, 1 or 2 tanks here and there, and there was algae all over the place. In this place, right, Buck Island, that I talked about before, why is there no algae there? The saddest thing in the world. Huge schools of tangs swimming around in these coral skeleton graveyards, still doing their job, but there not being enough coral for them to grow. Give you one more slide on this as we're hammering that part home. It's a little hard to see in the picture, but on the top part, I'm going to face this way for a minute so everyone feels like you're all my favorite children. You can see on the diadema, so in the 80s, there was a huge diadema die-off in the Caribbean, right? It was bad, and then we have a lot of algae reefs. At the same time, also, a lot of the parrotfish and herbivores were fished out for food fish. More algae, right? More algae is going to grow then, and human impacts. So we got a kind of wonderful soup of horror to let algae take over the reefs. as we're studying diadema to see what they do, it turns out they kind of have a range. They kind of have a home base and go out. They don't just wander randomly around the whole reef. So the top half of the reef, you can see, that's the diadema range. And the bottom of the half of that picture, the diadema don't get that far. On one side, no algae. On the other side, algae. That's pretty much my case. Right? My tank, we can see it in my tank as well. High, what people often consider ridiculous nutrients. Now I'm just high. I'm not ridiculous anymore. No algae going on in there. Herbivores, right? On my Eurobrace, algae, because the herbivores can't get to it. And 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Eurobrace all across the front was completely filled with algae. And I did my maintenance, I scraped it off, I cleaned my overflows so the water level went down a little bit, and then I went, I needed a picture of that, and I didn't take it. But luckily, over on that corner, water still gets up there. But, like I can get a cup of algae every week off of that Eurobrace. And the only thing that's going on between that and that is herbivoral access. That sounded scientific, herbivoral access, or drunk. Here's a frag system or a subsystem I have on my system. I was away for a while. I think something happened. There was like a temperature spike. Something happened, and there had been snails in there and urchins in there, and they died for some reason. I'm upset that I can't remember what it was. I got back, and it's covered in algae. It's a terrible picture, but you can see. I put in a bunch of snails and a couple urchins, and about 9 days later, that was what it looked like. And then today, it looks like this. And all that's in there, there's a rabbitfish in there too now, when I put the herbivores in. I have not added any herbivores since. I feed it, it gets the same water as the rest of the system. It's got some snails, it's got some urchins, and it's got a rabbitfish. No algae. This was taken on Tuesday, before the power outage. That's wonderful to have happen before you get on a plane to a reef conference. The only algae I could find in this system was on this temp probe, and the temp probe was floating, was hanging by the wire, so herbivores couldn't get to it. So I pushed it down by a rock, and I fully expect that algae to be gone by the time I get home. So what's your strategies for algae? I think whatever your philosophy is in reef keeping, and there's a million philosophies, and it has to make sense to you, and that's the only thing that matters, is that you understand it. You can change later on as new information or experience comes up, but what you think is going to be happening in your system, you have to have a plan for algae. Right? One of the plans is get it while it's small. Right? I think some people have problems because they see a little bit of algae, and then they start mucking with nutrients and expecting the algae to disappear, and it's not going to, because algae is really good at life, and it hates everything else, and it's going to try to steal all the real estate it can, right? It's gentrifying your neighborhood with algae gentrification. That's really dumb, and I want to chase it down and make it a thing. Gentrification of algae. So if you see a little bit of it, it takes a second. It's like Aptasia. People have 3 Aptasia and they buy Bergia. And it's like, what are you doing? Kill the 3 Aptasia and be done. If you add the Bergia and you wait, the Aptasia are going to keep growing. You might be able to get ahead of them eventually, but they're gone, right? And there's a million ways to do it. If you got a rock with Aptasia on it and you can remove it, take the rock out. Just put a new rock in. This person there's a little bit of bubble algae right here. And, so I would say take care of it right away. What this person was asking, shockingly to me, was should they break down their whole tank because there's bubble algae in it now? Right? That's kind of how I see people thinking, and I see people thinking that way, and it makes me a little nervous. All that stability we're trying to make, if you break down the tank, you're starting again from zero, and then it's going to be harder. While we're on bubble algae, I just want to throw out the idea, there's no reproductive anything inside the bubbles. There is not. I've talked to some phycologists about it. I've talked with Andy Ryan, who talked with phycologists about it, and I said, send me the paper that shows it. He sent it to me, and I said, this part, and he said, yeah, that part, and I said, and he said, oh, that's in phycologist speak, no one's going to understand it. But what it means is there's no reproductive anything inside of there. So pop them all you want, right? If you want to scrape them and pop them, great. When I see them, I just pop them. I don't, just scrape them off. Let them float away into your filter socks that everyone loves that I don't use. But there's no problem with popping the algae. That's a great myth if we could kill that. So really, what I like is herbivores. I think herbivores are really sexy. And I want to make two cautions about herbivores. Biological controls can always be hit and miss, right? When somebody says, my rabbitfish ate my bryopsis, you should get this rabbitfish, often, sometimes, other people get that rabbitfish, it will not touch bryopsis, right? So don't get a biological control unless you really like that animal. They are not surefire charity. I can't think of that word again. I couldn't think of a word earlier when I was introducing Adam Sandler, and now I've just frozen again. Philanthropic was the word before. So biological controls are not philanthropic. If you get something like, snails and things like that, that's okay. You can get snails. They're not really going to hurt anything in your tank. But if you get a rabbitfish, it might decide it likes to eat your zoanthids, which happens, right? So you're always taking a risk. So make sure you're not just buying it without understanding what it can do. And then the other caution is there's a couple of animals that make me squidgy when people recommend them. One of them is a sea hare. A sea hare can eat algae. It is one of the things that kind of can be thought of to actually mow down long algae. But then they have nothing to eat. And that makes me very sad because then it's going to die, and most people don't care because it's a snail without a shell on the outside. And people talk about moving them around, and if that's done responsibly, I'm all for it. But they often don't because, the problem's gone away. I don't know where the sea hare is. It's somewhere in the tank. So, ethically, that's an area I think we want to watch out for. And also the lettuce nudibranchs, same kind of thing. They can eat some algae, but then what are they going to do? And then they're going to starve in your tank, and we should feel bad when that happens. I mean, we could still decide to do it. Don't get me wrong, right? We kill animals all the time for all kinds of reasons, but doing it without being thoughtful about it is what makes me unhappy. Okay, so herbivores. You can't just throw herbivores in and expect they're going to do it. You want to set them up for success. And so what does that mean? Crop down long algae. You can't just throw them in and they're going to, in a big mess of algae, they're just going to chew it away. It's the same kind of thing maybe that, deer will eat the leaves off the tree, but they don't eat the branches, right? So you scrape it down, get it down as low as it can. Don't worry about eradicating it. Then your predators, your herbivores can get to it and eat it up. Problem rocks, this is the one that kills me the most. If you can pull a rock, if you got extra rocks in your sump and you got algae grown, just pull that rock out, take the corals off of it, let that rock bake, take another rock from your sump, put it back together on your reef. Your reef is a dynamic system and it's changing all the time. Your reef is never done. No matter what you do, you're going to have to change the aquascape at some point. If the corals are growing, you're going to have to eventually radically change your aquascape because corals grow up and they often die from below. That's how reefs are built, right? So if you're succeeding, you get corals growing up, the underneath gets shaded, doesn't get as much water movement or philanthropy, and eventually you're going to have to pull that out and chop it off and replant it. So don't be scared of, I got to replace a rock and move the corals around. You're going to have to do it anyway if you're successful. Joe Waiulo at Long Island talked about a 35-pound Pocillopora that he just took the tips off because he's not going to bother to lift up a 35-pound thing before he bleached that system. Kill it while it's small. We already went over that, but if you see a little bit of algae, there's several ways you can kill it while it was small. You can pull it off with your hand. You could use your bone shears or your cutters or needle nose pliers to scrape it off the rock. You could chip off a piece of that rock. You could pull that piece of rock off, saw that piece that's got the little bit of algae on it, put it back in your tank. You could use epoxy. This is my favorite. Because you can get, like Julian sells the coralline colored two-part epoxy. And he has several colors of it, I think 2 little fishies for sale. And you just smother the algae with it. You can do it with super glue if you want. You can actually flip the rock upside down and smother it that way too. But the smothering with epoxy is great because the two-part stuff, if you want to take it off, it just crumbles when you go to take it off, and then you've got your rock back the way you had it before. At the academy at Steinhardt, we had bryopsis, and we were fighting bryopsis and it was growing and growing and growing, and they wanted... Anyway, I eventually went in with a big ball of Z-Spar, which is a marine epoxy, and just smothered it all, just covered it. Done. Algae problem was over. We'd been fighting it for months, and now it's over because we killed it from space, because algae is gentrifying your reef. No, we'll figure it out. I already talked about that. Clip it off, smother, and pop out algae. Great. And pay attention to your herbivore population. So my revelation over the last couple of years is, that I learned in my life, was that the dish, I thought you could finish doing the dishes, and then there would be no more dishes to do. And it turns out there's always dishes. It turns out you finish the dishes, some jerk in your family will come put dishes right in the sink that you just finished cleaning, right? Your reef is like that. There's always going to be stuff you have to do. So just keep up on it a little bit. It's much easier than waiting till your dishes are all over the place. Just do them while they're small, right? So, but pay attention to your herbivore population. We tend to, because they work kind of unseen, and you see a few snails, and it's kind of boiling frog. One goes, another goes, and eventually, and then you only have one snail, and it's not doing the job, or you only have one urchin. And I saw this when I had a rabbitfish that had to be removed because it was eating my zoanthids. And within a week, I had algae popping up in all over in places. And I got a new herbivore, and boom, it went away. What does that say? Okay, good. Herbivores I like, because there's some herbivores I think are great, and I'm often saying I don't want to give recipes or tell people what to do, but these are the ones that I use and that I like. I love these tuxedo urchins. You can get them, Vosen Aquatics often has them small. The smaller they are, the better. You make them, don't you? Bill makes them. So talk to him afterwards, because we need more people like him making these for us. Jamie Craggs, another thing, he's done so much for us, but one other thing he decided to do was, instead of scraping the frag plugs where you've got your one tiny settled baby coral that you've worked for a year to make happen, and you've got to go in with dental tools and scrape algae away from it, he said, well, why don't we just get baby urchins? The idea may have come from Martin Moe, because I remember being at a workshop with Jamie and Martin, and the idea of using diadema for reef restoration was, how do we breed them? And I guess, oh yeah, there, John, you've got Martin's new book, Diadema Culture for Reef Restoration, right? So why don't we do that in the tanks? These guys are easy to breed as things go, yeah? Right, 80 days, and then they settle, and then they're tiny, something like that. But you can get them. You can also get them big wild caught, so if you want to do that, do that. But for my money, if you've cropped stuff down so they can get to it, they keep stuff really clean, and they do a minimal job of pushing stuff over. There's another urchin, I don't have a picture of it, sadly. It's the Lidochinus one. It's a Caribbean urchin. This one is an Indo-Pacific one. That does a good job, too. I think it's a little bit more of a bulldozer. You always see that one with the plastic hats on them. By the way, I love the idea that we care about getting plastic out of the ocean, but we'll print little plastic hats to put in our reefs. I think I just love that. I like a bunch of tangs. I like a yellow tang. I like a coal tang or coaly tang, depending on if you like pokey or poke. I don't like the powder blue tang. I'll say that another way. I love the powder blue tang. It's one of my favorite fish. I will never keep one again in a mixed reef because they're jerks. And I don't want to deal with that. But if you do, go ahead, but no, they can become terrors. So I keep a yellow tang, and I get them from biota because that seems easier versus not being able to get them at all from the wild. So there you go. Rabbitfish, I like rabbitfish too. I usually keep a tang and a rabbitfish in my tanks. In the smaller tanks, I only keep one because these fish can get a little larger. I think it's a good Taurus. The lined one, the one on the left, my left, that's a captive bred one from biota as well. It's apparently a biota commercial. Well, why not? But they're bringing all these captive bred things to market that no one else had a way to get. So good for biota. Snails I like Astrea snails. There's also, what's the big one that's a zebra one? It's all zebra striped, but they get huge, so I don't like it. A big giant trochus. I like these guys. They seem to do a nice job of keeping stuff mowed down as well. There's the Mexican turbo, and there's always debate about the Mexican turbo, and this is what's made me think, one of the things that's made me think that you can't trust biological controls to do their job. So you got to get Mexican turbos. And then somebody goes, okay, I got them, and they didn't mow down my algae. Someone will say it mows down their algae. I got them, they didn't mow down my algae. Well, you need them from a different part of Mexico. You got to get the right ones. But some people have very good success. I use these as well. Some people have very good success. They're not big and they're not horrible. They're just a nice snail, so they're fine too. I don't have a lot of these. I have 4 or 5 in my display. Then there's amphipods. So, I like to inoculate with amphipods. I sometimes go to the beach and collect amphipods. I used to do that a lot when I was breeding cephalopods a lot. So I'd be using them for food. So every week I was putting hundreds and hundreds of amphipods into my system. Now often I'm lazy, and we've been having a huge algae bloom in the Bay Area, so I'm not collecting anything because it's dead. But you can buy these relatively inexpensively. That's like $30 or $39 for 1,000 of them, and often they run double, because they have too many. So I like adding those as well. Those are the herbivores I like. The ones I don't like are the ones like the sea hare and the crispa, the lettuce nudibranch. So this is a horror show. This has gotten out of control. The person hasn't been on top of it, hasn't been doing it while it's small. I don't want to judge them because maybe they don't know they're getting advice, so we shouldn't shun people who have tanks like this. What do you do when this happens? You want to nuke it from space? You could do that. There's also variations of nuking from space. It doesn't mean a complete tank reset. You don't have to. And I think with all that rock, if you can avoid it, you don't want to throw away all that benthic succession that you've been working so hard to have. The tank is fine, you just have a bunch of algae. So how do you deal with horror? Right? Change out the rock. That's great. Flip the rock over. Said that before. Pull the rock out and scrub it. And you can do it a piece at a time. That's why this doesn't have to be onerous or make you cry. You can, every 2 days, pull out a piece of rock and deal with it and put it back in, and then do another one and do another one. Something that works for me is spraying muriatic acid on the rock, 10%. Be careful when you do it, but it definitely kills the algae. You let it sit for 20 minutes and put it back in, rinse it with tank water, put it back. Some people are reporting very good success using hydrogen peroxide for the same reason. So I haven't done that yet, but hey, go for it. It sounds great. You remove the algae by hand, right? So in that picture, you can remove 80% of that algae just by going in with your hand and pulling it out, right? So do that. Or you could do it with tools. The thing that's funny to me is when somebody has a tank like this one, and somebody says, well, if you're using a toothbrush to scrub the rock, make sure you siphon out the algae, because otherwise it will infect your tank. You're done, man. Whatever. So when I get in that size problem, I pull it out by hand, but I run one of these. So this is, what do they call it? The in-tank polishing filter. And it comes with a pleated cartridge, so it's a micron filter. I glue a magnet to the side of it so I can move it around the front glass because there's no space in my tanks for it. And I scrub the algae and pull the algae off and let it fly around, let it get everywhere, and let this suck out as much as it can. I think this is a better way to go than letting it go to the filter sock, because the filter sock is kind of a passive. You're hoping it goes over the overflow. There's some of that too. And I've done this when I set up the Secret Home Lab tanks, those 4 tanks I showed at the beginning. I came home and 2 of them were just filled with algae like in that horror show picture. And I just scraped it. And one of them was kind of empty, so that was easy. The other one had my baby corals in it. I did the same thing. And the algae was flying around. It was wrapping around the corals. I left that pump on for a day. The next day, most of it was gone. I went in and pulled some of it off by hand, and then added the herbivores, and it never came back. So filter it out. And by the way, this, is there anything else on that slide? Let me see. Yeah, no, good. The good thing about that is you can use it for all kinds of stuff. Storming your tank, you've got detritus or mullum because detritus is something that's going to break down. Mullum is already broken down. So my sump has got this much mullum in it. Don't care. But if you want to remove it, like I do in a frag tank, I stir everything up and I blast it out with the power head and then leave this in there for a couple of days, pull the pleated cartridge out, rinse it off with a hose, and it's good and ready to go. This is like a workhorse of my home lab. I have 3 of them now. So the too long didn't read version, it's actually longer than this, but algae problems are not fixed, they're managed. Just know you're going to have to manage them. And try not to eradicate it because it's part of the ecosystem that you've got going on there. The early life of the system, you need to think differently than in a mature system. There's a different management strategy you need for both of those. If it's too late, you have a plan, and you don't have to do it immediately, but you can do it slowly, or you can hit it hard in a weekend or a day and just get it over with. And you can get super lazy as it goes on because as your tank matures and your herbivores are balanced and everything's working out, you're in good shape. You can relax and enjoy the tank. And I would say that all of these things are rules of thumb. I don't think there are any rules in reef keeping. There is nothing I can tell you to do that will work for everybody all the time. So take it. If you disagree with me, I'd love to hear about it. If you want to do something else, go ahead. But these are all rules of thumb, and develop your own blue thumb, your own saltwater thumb. That's the key to success in reef keeping, is you understanding what you think you're doing, even if you're wrong. If you're wrong, you'll figure it out. If you're not, you'll keep building on that. And I need to thank everyone I know, and mostly fair use laws, because I ran out of time to credit everything. So check out our podcast, because apparently we have to pimp everything we do. And if that's not a cephalopod, but I love that picture. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. And thank you for your attention and coming out on a Sunday.